The disappearance and murder of Cati Blauvelt is a chilling tale of love gone wrong, betrayal, and a manhunt that spanned 6 years. In October 2016, 22-year-old Kati vanished after her shift at a local pet store, only for her body to be discovered 2 days later in an abandoned house. The prime suspect, her estranged husband, John Blauvelt, who fled the state with his 17-year-old girlfriend, Hannah Thompson, just hours before the body was found. What followed was a complex web of lies, a nationwide manhunt, and the painful journey toward justice for Kati's grieving family. In October 2016, 22-year-old Cati Blauvelt vanished after finishing her shift at a local pet store in Greenville, South Carolina. It was a typical day for Kati, but when she didn't show up to meet her friends as planned, alarm bells began to ring. Her family, worried and confused, quickly reported her missing to the police. What started as a missing person case soon took a much darker turn. 2 days later, Kati's body was discovered in the basement of an abandoned house in nearby Simpsonville. The grisly scene revealed that she had been brutally stabbed multiple times. Kati's murder shocked the local community. She had been a bright, kind young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Friends and family described her as caring, hard-working, and full of potential. The discovery of her body left her loved ones in disbelief, and they were plunged into a period of profound grief. The small town of Simpsonville was suddenly thrust into the spotlight as the mystery of her death unfolded. The police immediately focused their attention on Kati's estranged husband, John Blauvelt. The couple had experienced a rocky relationship, and they had been separated at the time of her death. Suspicion quickly mounted when it was discovered that John had fled the state shortly after Kati went missing. But John wasn't alone. With him was his 17-year-old girlfriend, Hannah Thompson. This raised even more questions about what had really happened in the days leading up to Kati's murder. John Blauvelt, who had been serving as a U.S. Army recruiter at the time, was now a fugitive. Not only had he abandoned his wife, but he had also deserted the army, adding another layer of complexity to the case. Authorities launched a manhunt, but John and Hannah had disappeared without a trace. For Kati's family, the pain of her loss was compounded by the fact that her killer was still out there, evading justice. Meanwhile, Kati's family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Her mother, Patricia, often spoke to the media, pleading for justice for her daughter. "We'll never forget about her," she said in one interview. "We'll always fight for her, no matter how long it takes." But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the family had to come to terms with the possibility that John might never be caught. The local community came together to mourn Kati's death. Candlelight vigils were held in her honor, and her friends shared stories of her kindness and gentle spirit. But beneath the surface, fear and confusion loomed. How could something like this happen in their small town? And how could a man simply disappear with a teenage girl in tow? The answers seemed far from reach. Investigators pieced together a timeline of the days leading up to Kati's death. They discovered that on the day she was murdered, John had dropped her off at the pet store, only to return later and commit the unthinkable act. Witnesses saw John and Hannah together near the scene of the crime, but by the time the body was discovered, they were long gone. The search for John became a top priority for law enforcement. The murder weapon was never found, but forensic evidence from the crime scene painted a clear picture of Kati's final moments. Authorities were convinced that John had carefully planned the murder, and that Hannah had played a role in helping him flee. But proving this would be a challenge, especially with the couple on the run. As the investigation unfolded, more details about John and Kati's troubled marriage came to light. Friends said that the relationship had been volatile for years, with frequent arguments and separations. Still, no one could have imagined it would end in such tragedy. The town of Simpsonville, was left to grapple with the haunting reality that someone they knew had committed such a heinous act. After John Blauvelt fled South Carolina with his teenage girlfriend, Hannah Thompson, a nationwide manhunt was launched to track him down. Law enforcement agencies, including U.S. Marshals, local police, and even the FBI, worked tirelessly to find him, but John proved to be elusive. The longer he remained at large, the more questions arose. How could a man on the run, with a teenager no less, evade capture for so long? The search for John spanned multiple states. Authorities received numerous tips about possible sightings, but none of them led to any concrete leads. The public followed the case closely, with updates about the manhunt regularly appearing in the news. John and Hannah had seemingly vanished into thin air, and with each passing day, it became harder to trace their movements. Hannah's role in the case was also a subject of intense speculation. Was she a willing accomplice, or had she been manipulated by John? At just 17, she was still a minor when the pair fled, which complicated the narrative. While some believed she had been coerced into helping him, others were convinced that she had played an active role in covering up Kati's murder. As months turned into years, the trail grew cold. Law enforcement officials continued to search for John, but it seemed as though he had mastered the art of staying hidden. Some speculated that he might have fled the country, while others believed he was living under a false identity somewhere in the United States. Meanwhile, Kati's family was left to wait, wondering if they would ever see justice served. Despite the lack of progress in the case, investigators remained determined. They had a warrant for John's arrest on charges of murder and possession of a weapon during the commission of a violent crime. But without any solid leads, the case remained frustratingly stagnant. The public's interest in the case began to wane, but for Kati's family, the pain of her loss was as fresh as ever. In the years that followed, Hannah eventually returned home to her family. She claimed that she had been abandoned by John and that she had wanted to come back all along. Her parents welcomed her home, relieved that their daughter was safe, but her return did little to answer the burning questions about her involvement in the case. Soon after, she was arrested and charged with obstructing justice and concealing a felony. Despite the charges against her, Hannah maintained her innocence, claiming that she had been unaware of John's plans on the day Kati was killed. However, investigators weren't convinced. They believed that Hannah had actively helped John flee the state and that she had lied to authorities about his whereabouts. The case took a dramatic turn in July 2022, when U.S. Marshals received a tip that led them to Medford, Oregon. After 6 long years on the run, John Blauvelt was finally apprehended. He had been living a quiet, low-profile life, trying to blend into the background. But his past had finally caught up with him. News of his capture spread quickly, and for Kati's family, it was a moment of relief, though their journey for justice was far from over. John was extradited to South Carolina, where he would stand trial for Kati's murder. The years of hiding were over, but the questions surrounding the case were still very much alive. The upcoming trial would finally bring some answers, and perhaps, by the time U.S. Marshals caught up with John Blauvelt in Oregon in 2022, Kati's murder had remained unsolved for 6 long years. Investigators pieced together a timeline showing that John and Hannah had been on the run, living a transient life, often homeless, and trying to evade capture. In the years following the crime, the details of John and Kati's rocky relationship came to light, and Hannah was charged with obstructing justice for her role in helping John flee. The case, which once captivated national attention, moved toward a trial that promised to finally answer the questions about Kati's tragic death. In 2024, nearly 8 years after the murder of Cati Blauvelt, her estranged husband, John Blauvelt, finally faced trial. The courtroom was packed with reporters, spectators, and Kati's grieving family, all of whom had waited years for this moment. The trial was not just about the facts of the case, it was about closure for a family and a community that had been haunted by Kati's murder for far too long. Prosecutors laid out their case against John, detailing the events leading up to Kati's death. They presented evidence that placed John at the scene of the crime, including witness testimony and forensic data. The prosecution argued that John had killed Kati in cold blood, motivated by his desire to be with his teenage girlfriend, Hannah Thompson. They painted a picture of a man who had carefully planned the murder, staging it to make it appear as though Kati had been the victim of a random act of violence. The defense, on the other hand, tried to argue that John was innocent. They claimed that the evidence against him was circumstantial and that the prosecution had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that John was the killer. They also pointed to the fact that the murder weapon had never been found, suggesting that this created reasonable doubt about John's guilt. Hannah's involvement in the case remained a point of contention throughout the trial. While she had been charged with obstructing justice, her role in the murder itself was still unclear. Some believed that she had been manipulated by John, while others felt that she had been a willing accomplice. The prosecution argued that Hannah had helped John flee the state after the murder, but her defense team maintained that she had been a scared teenager caught in a terrible situation. Kati's family attended every day of the trial, listening intently as both sides presented their arguments. For them, this was more than just a legal battle, it was a fight for their daughter's memory. They wanted to ensure that Kati's life and the injustice of her death were not forgotten. As the trial progressed, emotions ran high, especially when Kati's family members took the stand to share their memories of her and the impact her death had on their lives. In the closing arguments, the prosecution made a final plea to the jury to convict John Blauvelt for the murder of his wife. They emphasized the evidence, the motive, and the fact that John had fled the state immediately after the crime, all pointing to his guilt. The defense, however, continued to argue that the case was based on assumptions and that the prosecution had failed to meet the burden of proof. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. John Blauvelt was found guilty of the murder of Cati Blauvelt. For Kati's family, the verdict brought a sense of justice, but it could never bring back the daughter they had lost. The courtroom erupted in emotion as Kati's family embraced one another, relieved that after years of uncertainty, justice had been served. The trial also shed light on the complexities of domestic violence and the tragic outcomes that can result when it is left unchecked. Many saw Kati's story as a warning about the dangers of toxic relationships and the need for greater support for victims. The media coverage of the trial kept the public engaged, and Kati's name became synonymous with the fight for justice for victims of domestic abuse. As John was sentenced to life in prison, the chapter on Kati's murder closed, but the scars it left behind remained. For Kati's family, the verdict was bittersweet. They had achieved justice, but the pain of losing her would never fade. With John Blauvelt sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his wife, Kati, the community of Greenville began to heal from the trauma of the case. The trial had brought closure in a legal sense, but for Kati's family, the emotional toll of her death would last a lifetime. Her mother, Patricia, continued to speak publicly about the importance of remembering Kati, not just as a victim, but as a vibrant, loving young woman who had been taken too soon. For the Blauvelt family, the trial also marked the end of years of uncertainty and fear. They had spent years wondering where John was and whether he would ever be brought to justice. Now, they could finally move forward, though the pain of losing Kati would always remain. Hannah Thompson's role in the case continued to raise questions. She had pleaded guilty to charges of obstruction of justice and misprision of a felony, but her actions on the day of the murder were still debated. Some believed she had been coerced by John, while others felt that she had been more involved than she let on. Regardless, she was now facing the consequences of her choices, and her future remained uncertain. In the wake of the trial, conversations about domestic violence and toxic relationships grew louder. Kati's story became a symbol for many, a reminder that abuse can escalate into deadly violence. Advocacy groups used her case to push for more resources and support for victims of domestic violence, hoping to prevent future tragedies like hers. As the years passed, the memory of Cati Blauvelt continued to live on in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. Her family set up a foundation in her name, dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence. They organized fundraisers and awareness campaigns, determined to turn their personal tragedy into a force for good. The case also left a lasting impact on the local community. For many, the murder had shattered the illusion of safety in their small town. But it also brought people together, united in their support for Kati's family and their desire for justice. The vigils held in her memory became annual events, where the community could come together to remember her life and reaffirm their commitment to preventing future violence. Law enforcement officials reflected on the case as one of the most challenging of their careers. The 6-year manhunt for John Blauvelt had tested their patience and determination, but in the end, justice had prevailed. The case was used as a training example for future investigators, highlighting the importance of persistence and teamwork in solving complex, high-profile crimes. As time went on, Kati's story remained a powerful reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of violence. Though her life was cut short, her legacy continued to inspire change and bring awareness to important issues. For those who knew her, she would always be remembered as more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, and a friend whose spirit lived on. In the end, the case of John and Cati Blauvelt was not just about one tragic murder. It was about a family's resilience in the face of unimaginable loss, a community's determination to seek justice, and the ongoing fight to protect vulnerable individuals from violence. Kati's story, though heartbreaking, left a lasting legacy of hope, love, and justice.
This is a tough one, this deep dive. We're dealing with a young life cut tragically short, a family left searching for answers. Cati Blauvelt, just 22 years old. It's a story that really stays with you.
It's the kind of case that reminds us just how vulnerable any of us can be.
Exactly. So Kati, she was living in Greenville, South Carolina, working at a pet store full of life, loved animals. October 2016, she's working a shift, finishes up, and that's the last anyone sees of her. Gone. Vanished.
And I imagine for her family and friends, it must have been just pure terror, that agonizing, not knowing what happened.
2 days later, they find her body, abandoned, in the basement of an empty house, multiple stab wounds. It's heartbreaking. And of course, immediately, suspicion falls on her estranged husband, John.
The estranged husband. That's often where investigators start in these cases. And this one had an extra layer of complexity because John Blauvelt wasn't just any guy next door.
Right, he wasn't just some random guy. John was an army recruiter. Think about that for a second. The trust associated with that position, the discipline, the access to resources, and it makes the whole thing even more unsettling.
It really does add another dimension to the case. And to make matters worse, he disappears too.
Oh, he doesn't just disappear. He takes off with his 17-year-old girlfriend, Hannah Thompson. Vanishes.
And that right there, that tells you this wasn't some impulsive act. This seems like it was planned, thought out.
So we have a potential crime of passion, but with a level of premeditation, a military background involved. Did he use his training, his contacts to vanish like this?
It's a question that investigators would have grappled with right from the start. Was this a calculated escape plan? And what about Hannah? Was she a willing participant, or did John manipulate her into going with him? A victim herself.
17 years old. It's hard to imagine what must have been going through her mind. And that question about Hannah's role, that's something that's going to follow this case every step of the way. 6 years! 6 years on the run. It's almost unfathomable to live like that, looking over your shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop.
The pressure must have been immense for John, but also for the investigators on the case. Dead-end leads, whispers, and rumors. It's like trying to catch smoke.
And for Katusi's family, that agonizing wait for answers, for justice, it's unimaginable.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the complexities of this case. We're talking about a trained Army recruiter, someone who understands evasion, blending in, disappearing.
He had a 6-year head start, for crying out loud. It makes you wonder, what could they even do? How do you even begin to track someone who doesn't want to be found?
Well, it's harder than it used to be, that's for sure. The digital age, all our technology, it cuts both ways. It gives investigators tools, but also means anyone can learn the tricks of the trade. Burner phones, fake IDs.
Right. It's like something out of a spy thriller, except this is real life with very real consequences.
Exactly. And for a time, it seemed like John might actually get away with it. But then, a twist.
Hannah, she resurfaces. After all that time, what happened? Did she get a conscience? Did something happen?
The details are still a bit murky. What we do know is that Hannah Thompson returned, and her return would change everything.
She's arrested, and this is where her story gets really interesting, really tragic.
Right, because now we're forced to ask, was she a victim of John's manipulation all along, or did she play a more active role in his evasion?
The sources we looked at, they paint a complicated picture.
They do, and I think that's what makes this case so compelling, so unsettling. There are no easy answers, just more questions.
6 years is a long time to stay hidden. How did they finally catch up with him? Did he slip up?
Not exactly a slip-up, more like, even when you're careful, the digital world, it leaves a trail. Someone recognized him from a wanted poster out in Oregon. Imagine that. All that way, trying to build a new life, and someone spots him.
Oregon. Wow. Okay, so they bring him back to South Carolina. What's the prosecution's case like after 6 years?
It's largely circumstantial, right? But there are key pieces. The cell phone records put him near the house around the time Katie died. They had witnesses who saw them together earlier that day.
No murder weapon.
No murder weapon, and that's exactly what the defense focused on. They hammered that point home. No direct link, no physical evidence tying him to the act itself. They played up the military background too, good character, that sort of thing. Tried to create doubt.
So did it work? Did the jury buy it?
Well, that's where Hannah's testimony comes in. And this is where it gets really fascinating, really tragic. You have this young woman caught up in something she clearly didn't fully grasp at 17. Her testimony was pivotal. Some sources say she came across as manipulated, a victim herself. Others, they question how much she helped him stay hidden.
What a weight on her shoulders. Okay, but what about the verdict? What did the jury decide?
Guilty. John Blauvelt, convicted of murder, sentenced to life in prison. Can you imagine what that moment was like for Kati's family? After 6 years...
Bittersweet, I imagine. Justice, but it doesn't bring her back.
Exactly. And what's really stayed with me researching this is what happened after. Kati's family. They channeled all that grief, that anger. They started a foundation in her names to help victims of domestic violence.
A really powerful reminder that even out of such darkness, something good can emerge.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And for anyone listening who might be trapped in a similar situation, please remember, you're not alone. Reach out. There are resources, people who will listen, who understand. You deserve to be safe.
This case, it's a tragedy, no doubt, but Kati's memory, her family's strength, it's testament to resilience, to the power of fighting for justice, for change. It's a conversation that needs to continue, and we all have a role to play in preventing these tragedies from happening again.
In 2024, John Blauvelt was convicted of Kati's murder, and justice was served, bringing a sense of closure to Kati's family. The trial revealed the chilling details of Kati's final moments, and John was sentenced to life in prison. While the legal chapter of this story came to an end, the emotional scars for Kati's loved ones will never fully heal. Kati's legacy now lives on through the awareness her case has raised about domestic violence and the dangers of abusive relationships. Her family continues to honor her memory, ensuring her story is never forgotten.